السلام عليكم. يشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم صل على محمد. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Dr. Aqil, for your introduction. And also thank you to Fida for all of her hard work to put this together, and for choosing a photo of me when I had more hair. That was very kind of you. Well, the hair has gone from my head down to my face, I guess, since I got a full beard now. That was very kind of you. So like Dr. Aqil said, this overall program in which I'm engaging here is part of a larger project. And this part is in many ways one of the most difficult, as we'll see when we go through it, because the discussion of l-Qarnayn has led to many debates. If you go through the tafsīr tradition, you'll actually find that many of the mufassirun, they'll give you certain different perspectives. And Ibn Aden, in his Lumbard fi ulum al-kitab, he actually, oftentimes, he'll give you a series of these, and then he divides them into aqsam, into variations or divisions, and then he just says, وَيَحْتَمِلُ كُلُّ الْأَقْسَامِ. All of these different variations, all of these different interpretations are possible. And in some ways, he's alluding there to the fact that, well, when it comes to the account of l-Qarnayn, we don't really entirely know. My contention, as you'll see as we go through, is that in some ways that may be intentional within the Quran, and that even within the Quran, and specifically within Surah Al-Kahf, we find clues that tell us that this is intentional and why. And this gives us some clues for how to read these particular narratives. Now, as Dr. Aqil said, this whole project, this particular paper, is part of a broader project. The first of which was Decolonizing Quranic Studies that came out about 18 months ago. And I'm honored that it's actually already been translated into Arabic, Turkish, Albanian, and somebody told me that they want to translate into Persian, but I don't know if that's going to happen. But then Semantics of Gratitude in the Quran is applying Izutsu's methodology in a new way to try to find means by which we can basically develop methodologies that are congruent with and in dialogue with the classical tafsir tradition, yet at the same time form a bridge to methodologies that are employed within the Western Academy. This article, A Role for Izutsu's Philosophical Semantics in Contemporary Tafsir, is essentially explaining that methodology in greater detail, whereas the first one was an application of the methodology. And then you have this paper that we'll be talking about today, as well as another article on Islam and the Art of Knowing in a Postmodern World, which is going into using decolonial, post-colonial analysis for talking about the manner in which we can conceptualize the classical Islamic intellectual tradition in broad strokes, looking at the factors that unify that tradition, even though it is multifaceted. Now, this particular presentation is going to go through 4 stages. First, I'm going to set the context with a little bit of a discussion of decolonial approaches to the Quran. Then we'll talk about the function of Quranic narratives. As I said, I think that Surah Al-Kahf actually gives us some keys for this. Then I'll talk about Quranic hermeneutics in historical context. The reason for doing that is that I think we tend in the current day and age to have a very limited understanding of tafsir. People often say that they're looking for, what is the right tafsir of this verse? Well, you go through the classical tradition, and a lot of times the mufassirun, they're not looking for the right tafsir. They're looking for different perspectives that have come regarding particular ayat. It's even as if in some ways the classical tafsir tradition, especially as it develops and becomes more mature, they're looking at the Quran and saying, well, this is the infinite word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Its infinitude opens it up to multiple different possibilities and applications in different contexts. And then this will set the stage for talking about l-Qarnayn. Hopefully I won't spend too much time on the other issues. Now, as regards decolonial approaches to the Quran. It's important to talk about what is decolonial, post-colonial, and anti-colonial. Many mistake decolonial and post-colonial for anti-colonial. In my understanding, it should ultimately be anti-colonial. If anybody's been paying attention to recent events in social media and how many people who claim to be doing decolonial analysis are silent when it comes to the genocide in Palestine. And this is as if all of a sudden, because this is the proper line of the colonizers, we're not going to say anything, even though we're going to go out and make our academic careers on establishing our post-colonial discourse. So it's important to look at how we actually can use post-colonial and decolonial analysis effectively. Now, John Henrik Clarke was a post-colonial thinker before post-colonial thinking became in vogue, which is one of the reasons why I like to look at him. He says, to control a people, you must first control what they think about themselves and how they regard their history and culture. And when your conqueror makes you ashamed of your culture and your history, he needs no prison walls and no chains to hold you. Essentially, what he is saying here is that a necessary constituent part of colonization is what some people refer to as colonialization, which is when you set up the entire educational, epistemic framework in order to actually rob from people their right to define themselves and their right to engage their own traditions in accord with the methodologies that they have developed over time. I love this quote. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard this. Until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter. We could also put that to say that until the colonized speak in terms of their own traditions, the colonizer will always write a version of that history that excuses their colonial project. Wael Halak goes into this in depth in his recent series of books. He says the common denominator of Orientalist academia undoubtedly remains one of epistemic superiority, which is to say that respect and tolerance come with a dose of epistemic self-confidence and often arrogance. That still assumes, consciously or not, the validity, and I would add here the superiority, of the Euro-American modern project, especially as it has been guided by the paradigmatic principles of the Enlightenment. Now, in other words, that there is a process within Western academia that always says, well, you know, this is nice what you people are saying over here. However, it must be set within the particular modes of analyses that we use within the academy in order for us to consider it to be a valid approach to these texts. One of the ways in which you find this in Quranic studies in particular is that al-Qur'an, the sciences of the Quran, the methodologies that we have developed for over 1,000 years and are still being developed and refined, as well as the tafsīr tradition, they're often thrown out when people are writing about issues within the Western Academy. And you'll even find this, and I myself have found this, and my colleagues have found this, that you submit an article to a particular journal, and they'll actually deny the publication of that because they've sent it to a reviewer that says, oh no, you can't be citing Fakhruddin Razi here. You can't be citing At-Tabari here. You can't be citing, Az-Zamakhshari here. You have to be citing scholar Y, who is situated in some university within the West. Now, so to go over what is colonization, colonialism, and colonialization. These are important terms to distinguish. All right, colonization is basically the physical occupation, usually by military force, getting land and resources. Colonialism is the socio-political, and I would add the intellectual and epistemic domination of people. And colonialization is thought production that legitimizes colonialism and neocolonialism while claiming universalism. This issue of while claiming universalism is of fundamental importance for understanding this because it is situating it as if And when we say, let's say, for example, something that we all know, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The UN Declaration of Human Rights is a well-intentioned document, but it centers a neoliberal, secular human understanding of what human rights are. And people have even written critiques of it from within a context of Confucian thought, within the context of Buddhist thought, saying that there's a particular idea of what rights are and what the human being is that underlies this document that makes it non-universal, in effect. Now, this is a very good definition of colonialism that is given by Lina Salameh, who her articles in this field are fantastic, and I think everybody should be reading them. All right. Whereas colonialism is the socio-politic domination of a territory, coloniality is a mode of thought that legitimizes colonialism and neocolonialism while espousing universalism. In my article on decolonizing Quranic studies, I employ this analysis to look at how Quranic studies is currently situated within the Western Academy. It is an underlying assumption of the modern Euro-American Academy that non-Western epistemologies are fit to be the object of investigation or analysis, but that they are not fit to be the tools of analysis through which we might understand texts and the world, or through which we might even analyze the dominant Eurocentric epistemologies. This is of fundamental importance because it ultimately, what this means is that the actual tools that Muslims have developed for over 1,000 years, that Buddhists have developed for over 1,000 years, Hindus, multiple other cultures, that these are considered to be invalid tools for looking through the texts and the histories of non-European peoples. It must all be situated within a particular framework that derives from and developed within the Euro-American Academy. Now, this is a quote, again, to go back to John Henrik Clarke, because I think that in many ways, when you look at decolonial analysis, there are certain people, such as Frantz Fanon is one of them, and John Henrik Clarke is another, that really kind of bring a visceral edge to it because they have experienced and gone through colonization themselves and seen the depth of psychological impact that it has. So he says, if we are going to be masters of our destiny, we must be masters of the ideas that influence that destiny. Now, this is to say that we must be masters of the epistemological frameworks through which our history and our texts are understood, and thus employ our own methodologies, while developing methodologies that are in dialogue with those that have developed in other frameworks. So in other words, this doesn't mean that we exclude observations that come from within the Western Academy. A great example is that within the Western Academy, the study of manuscripts and dating manuscripts has been far more developed. This has actually given us the tools to find the best material evidence for identifying the time at which the Quran was collected, and has in fact confirmed that the Quran was most likely collected and put into its final rasam, its final form, at the time that Muslim histories attest. So we have a methodology that we can borrow from the West that actually helps us to investigate and understand aspects or affirm aspects of our history more effectively. This can come up with certain historical observations as well, and even sometimes with linguistic observations, as with Toshihiko Izutsu. Now, let me translate into the actual process of reading Quranic narratives. This is something that you have many people kind of writing about, and there's a lot of guesswork, especially when it comes to Surah Al-Kahf. And there's a lot of articles that try to speculate as to where certain stories came from. Now, my contention is many of you know that the Quran is, beyond a doubt, the most self-referential text of the Abrahamic scriptural traditions. It tells us about its nature. It tells us multiple things about where it came from and the intention behind the text itself. It even provides us verses that tell us how to read the Quran. وَالْقُرْآنَ الْفَجْرِ إِنَّ قُرْآنَ الْفَجْرِ كَانَ مَشْهُودًا. I'm sure we're all familiar with this verse. وَرَتِّلِ الْقُرْآنَ تَرْتِيلًا, and recite the Quran in a measured pace. So when is the best time to read it? What is the best way to read it? And it advises us to remember, وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. Could even go, there are other verses that even tell us about the process of interpreting the Quran. Right? ثُمَّ إِنَّ عَلَيْنَا بَيَانًا. Right? فَإِذَا قَرَأْنَا فَاتَّبِعْ قُرْآنًا. فَإِذَا قَرَأْنَاهُ, فَاتَّبِعْ قُرْآنًا. So when we recite it, follow its recitation, then surely it is for us to explain it, or its explanation is from us. Right? And then there's this famous verse, وَلَا يَأْتُوكَ بِمَثَلٍ إِلَّا جِئْنَاكَ بِالْحَقِّ وَأَحْسَنَ التَّفْسِيرَ. They do not come to you with any parable, but that we bring you the truth and a better explanation. This is actually very interesting if you actually look at the story of how Surah Al-Kahf itself came up. Because this is people are coming with stories, and then Surah Al-Kahf is that the Prophet ﷺ is giving another explanation. And we'll see how that works. But let me just go back to Quranic narratives for a minute. As many of you know, there's this famous saying that you found, nobody actually knows where this originates. It is found throughout the tafsīr tradition. Al-Qasas jundun min junudillah. Stories are one of the armies among the armies of God. And indeed, when we go to the Quran, narratives, stories are between 1/3 to 1/4 of the text. I love this saying by Flannery O'Connor. A story is a way to say something that can't be said any other way. You tell a story because a statement is inadequate. You illustrate something to people. And anybody who has kids knows how this works all the time. This is a wonderful book for anybody who's interested in literature, children's literature in particular. Vigen Gurian writes, a good moral education addresses both the cognitive and affective dimensions of human nature. Stories are an irreplaceable medium for this kind of moral education. That is, the education of character. One of the reasons that I love this particular quote is because the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا بُئِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I was only sent to perfect the noble character traits. And we all know the famous saying of Aisha when she was asked about his khuluq. She said, كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ. His character traits were the Quran. And you could take this back, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali says that all modes of knowledge are essentially about purifying the heart, purifying the soul, or training the heart, purifying the soul, and preparing for the akhirah. And so by that logic, all that we have in the Quran would, of course, be with that particular objective. Now, moving to Surah Al-Kahf itself. This, as you all know, this is ayah 22 of Surah Al-Kahf, comes right after the account of Ashab al-Kahf, the companions of the cave. سَيَقُولُونَ ثَلَاثَةٌ رَابِئُهُمْ قَلْبُهُمْ وَيَقُولُونَ خَمْسَةٌ سَادِسُهُمْ قَلْبُهُمْ. And I think really the key here is رَجْمًا بِالْغَيْبِ, right? Casting lots at the unseen or guessing at the unseen. It says, قُلْ رَبِّي أَعْلَمْ بِإِدَّتِهِمْ مَا يَعْلَمُهُمْ إِلَّا قَلِيلٌ. My Lord knows their number. None know them save a few. So argue not concerning them. فَلَا تُمَارِ فِيهِمْ مِرَاءً ظَاهِرًا وَلَا تَسْتَفْتِ فِيهِمْ مِنْهُمْ أَحَدًا. Nor seek a ruling, or we could really say in this, not necessarily a ruling, but an opinion from any of them about them, meaning the Ashab al-Kahf. So in other words, you've received the revelation, all right? This is now, and as regards other aspects of the story, Unless you have a clear proof, don't go into a debate about this. Now, a clear proof could be understood both as something that comes from revelation and as something that you arrive at through sound syllogistic reasoning. Now, this is interesting. This comes at the end of this passage. This is, it's one page, verses 22 through 27. They kind of summarize the issues of how to read and understand the story of the Ashab al-Kahf. And you have وَاتْلُ مَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيْكَ مِنْ كِتَابِ رَبِّكَ لَا مُبَدِّلَ لِكَلِمَاتِهِ وَلَنْ تَجِدَ مِنْ دُونِهِ مُلْتَحَدًا. This can also be read لَا مُبَدَّلَ. That's in some of the qira'at, and that's important, as we'll see. So recite that which has been revealed unto you from the book of your Lord. None alters his word, or there is no alteration of his word. La mubaddala li kalimatihi. You will not find refuge apart from him, or you will not find anything to return to apart from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now this is why this is interesting. This is Shihabuddin al-Alusi, Ruh al-Ma'ani fi tafsīr al-Qur'an. One of my favorite tafsīr. This is a fantastic tafsīr. It is said, this is one of the interpretations that he has for this verse. He doesn't have one interpretation for any verse. He gives you lots of different opinions. It is said that the manner in which this verse is connected to what precedes is that when God forbade delving into disputes, لَا تُمَارِ فِيهِمْ إِلَّا مِرَاءً ظَاهِرًا, and seeking rulings regarding it, he commanded the Prophet to recite what was revealed to him regarding their affair, أَمْرِهِمْ. As if what was said is, recite what was revealed to you regarding their affair, leave it at that, and do not seek more than that or follow that. Hold fast to what I revealed, and it's just whom, I'm putting that as what it's returning to, the preposition. Do not delve into disputation with them, and do not ask any of them their opinion. So what is said here, al-kalam, is connected to the prohibitions preceding it. So what is meant by what is revealed, ma uhiya ilayk, is the verses that contain the exposition of the stories of the companions of the cave. In other words, do not you yourselves engage in rajman bil ghaib, speculating at the unseen regarding this particular story. Now, when we get to the narratives in Surah Al-Kahf, we have three major narratives: the companions of the cave, Moses and Khidr, and l-Qarnayn. What is interesting about these is all three of these, particularly the companions of the cave and l-Qarnayn, they are all playing upon and engaging narrative accounts that are mutadawila, that are spread, and people are talking about them within the Near Eastern context of late antiquity. And by late antiquity, this is used to identify the period of about the 3rd century AD to, some people put it the 7th, others put it the 8th century, some even take it all the way to the 9th century. But it's a large milieu in which multiple cultures are mixing within the arena of the Near East. And for those of you, of course, many of us know that there are ways in which the Quran comments upon multiple different positions within Christianity regarding the nature of Isa alayhi salam. So when, for example, Fakhruddin Razi comments upon these verses, he ends up going into the books of the Christians and summarizing all of their different arguments to try to figure out what it is that the Quran is saying about the nature of Isa alayhi salam in relation to these particular theological debates that the Christians are having. My contention is that we could actually say the same thing regarding this. The story of the Ashab al-Kahf is the most widespread account of what we could call wilaya, sanctity, some would put it, or sainthood, within the Near Eastern milieu. Every single religious community had some version of this story that they were working with. In that sense, it's almost natural that at some point within the Quran it would be addressed. When we get to the story of l-Qarnayn, as we'll see, it is drawing from aspects of the legend of Alexander, or being in dialogue with those aspects. Again, this was an extremely widespread narrative. So it is natural that the Quran, coming within that, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we do not send a prophet save with the tongue of his people, this could be part of that interpretation. These are stories that people would know of. These are stories that were in the air. And so the Quran is making proclamations regarding them. Moses and Khidr is a little bit more complicated because it's got aspects of the Alexander legend in it. It's a little bit more difficult to kind of unwind all of the strands. I'm not going to get into it here. Alhamdulillah. Now, so looking at Quranic hermeneutics in its historical context is, I think, very important for that, because as I said at the outset, there is a tendency to have a very narrow view of tafsir in the contemporary period. Anybody have any idea how many tafsirs were written in Arabic? Anybody want to guess? There's a lot of them, yeah. Oh, hundreds, yeah, actually. So if you were to take manuscripts, it would say about 2,400. Manuscripts are different. Now, not all of these are full tafsir, all right? And so even some of the tafsir that famous mufassirun wrote that weren't completed, they're not full. But so you got 2,400 there in manuscripts. Now, take a few of those out because some of them are probably somebody cataloged something under a different name. So let's say we could take it down to 2,000. Then go to the tabaqat literature. And then you're going to find another 1,500 that are referred to that we don't have copies of. Now, and we probably never will. The Mongol invasion wiped out a lot of things that we will never know. And of course, other events of history. But so let's just put it at 3,500 or thereabouts, between 3,500 and 4,000. Of those, less than 300 have appeared in printed form in the current day and age. So even if you're going to all of the printed tafsir, even if you're spending all of your time online, going to all these accounts that have all of the tafsir, you are only able to access 10% or less of the tafsir tradition when you're looking at that. So there's a lot that we don't know. And this is a very important saying by Walid Saleh, who I consider to be within the Western Academy, the leading scholar of tafsir today. He says, unlike other Islamic sciences, which systematize their methodological underpinnings, the Quranic commentary tradition never established unanimous rules for how to interpret the Quran. There was more than one hermeneutical theory in medieval Islam. There were, in fact, multiple hermeneutical theories. In the current environment, what we've seen over the last 100 years or so, there have been efforts to kind of limit Islam and limit tafsir to one or two hermeneutical approaches. And this is actually contrary to our tradition itself. Just some examples. Muhammad bin Jarir al-Tabari. Right? Many people say that al-Tabari's Jami' Bayan an Ta'wil al-Quran is the most important tafsir. And they refer to al-Tabari as the dean of the Mufassirun. When al-Tabari's tafsir came out, it was innovative. Nobody had done what he had done before. And then, that is to say, for every single verse, you've got multiple transmissions with complete isnads and sometimes an evaluation of the differences. Nobody had done it in a complete form before. There have been moves towards it, but it was innovative. Al-Tha'labi's Al-Kashf wal-Bayan fi Tafsir al-Quran. Al-Tha'labi determines the content of tafsir that was to come forward from that time. He in many ways follows the methodology of al-Tabari by giving multiple opinions, but now we're including things that don't go back to the first generations. We're getting the opinions of other scholars, we're getting the opinions of mutakallimun from different, we're getting the opinions of other people developing upon the Salaf, the first generations in this. You go Fakhruddin Razi. Fakhruddin Razi's tafsir. If you are not trained in kalam, if you've spent your entire life reading tafsir, you are a master of tafsir, but you are not well trained in kalam, you are not going to understand Razi's tafsir. This is a very new approach in tafsir at its time. And all the way up to our own day, Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur. Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur, at-Tahrir wa tanwir, this is a beautiful tafsir. Excellent linguistic analysis, but also he actually brings in New Testament and Old Testament as a proof text for some of his interpretations. This is al-Biqai does that somewhat before, but this is an entirely new approach. We could go into Bursawi and others, al-Alusi, others. There are many examples of how tafsir continues to develop new methodological approaches, but they are always in dialogue with and building upon those that came before. Just to give us an idea of how little we actually know about the tafsir tradition, here are 3 very important tafsirs. Until today, how many of you had heard of Lumbard ta'wil fi ma'ani tanzil? Anybody ever heard of this tafsir before? Note, he is a contemporary of Ibn Kathir. Who's heard of the tafsir of Ibn Kathir? Everybody, all right? All right, well, there are 326 manuscripts by count in the manuscript catalogs around the world of Lumbard ta'wil fi ma'ani tanzil. Anybody want to guess how many there are of Ibn Kathir? How many manuscripts? The pre-modern period. 67. Right? So this tafsir that nobody cites, nobody talks about, there's not a single study of it done in that I know of in any language. All right? It was the 8th most widely circulated tafsir by manuscript count in the pre-modern period. And we know nothing about it. All right? Sheikh Zadeh Muhammad al-Kujawi, the most widely circulated Hashia on al-Baydawi's Anwar al-Tanzil, 470 manuscripts, making it the 5th most widely distributed tafsir of the pre-modern period. Nothing. Nobody has studied it. I mean, there are people who have studied, I'm sure, who have read it and such. But in terms of it actually entering into our academic discourse regarding the Quran and its interpretation, nothing. And just another example, bin Adl, Lumbard fi ulum al-Kitab, which is a great tafsir. This is a great tafsir. And it's number 14 in terms of manuscript count. So this really, there are so many things that we don't know. And in fact, there has been a tendency to privilege tafsir, and I won't get into the politics behind that, that are actually not representative of how the ulama engaged the Quran and what was the actual discourse regarding the Quran in the pre-modern period. Now, this brings us, how am I doing on time? Oh, I'm perfect. l-Qarnayn, all right. This is exactly it. All right. Now we are where we were hoping to arrive at. All right. The story of l-Qarnayn. This is where things get very complicated for multiple reasons, and I might upset some people. All right. Now, the story of l-Qarnayn provides a Quranic account of another one of these stories from the Near Eastern milieu, regarding which there are many speculations. The Quran introduces the account after it said, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنْ ذِي الْقَرْنَيْنِ قُلْ سَأَتْلُ عَلَيْكُم مِّنْهُ ذِكْرًا. I will, how would we translate that? It's, I will mention something about him to you. This is very interesting, because it's kind of like saying, okay, well, you asked about it. I'm not going to tell you the whole story. I'll tell you a little something about him, all right? Now, when read in light of injunctions to not seek knowledge of the unseen that follow from the stories of the companions of the cave, this implies that we do not need to know all of the details, however curious we may be. It also provides a hint that many of the details listeners wanted to hear would not be provided, as if to say, okay, I'll tell you something about him, but not everything that you want to know. Now, Muslim scholars debate whether l-Qarnayn was a prophet who received revelation wahi or a saint who received inspiration from textual proofs itself. You could argue either way. Razi and Zamakhshari report that some people even said that he was an angel. That's a very minority opinion, but that's 3 different kind of types of beings that he could be. Nobody said he was a jinn, so alhamdulillah for that. At least I haven't come across it. All right. So the story of l-Qarnayn is one of the matters about which the Jews of Medina, as you know, are reported to have asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam when they instructed the Meccans to ask him questions that would tell us about his prophethood. Now, this particular narration, which we all know regarding the story of l-Qarnayn, actually, it's not sahih. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani says that there's actually, one unknown person within the isnad. Nonetheless, it is, when it comes to Asbab al-Nuzul, it's the best account that we have. L-Qarnayn is understood by most as a reference to Alexander the Great. Well, that's tafsīr. That's not in the Quran. That's tafsīr. Now, this is where things get very complicated, where there's been a lot of literature within the Western Academy as of late. All right? These are some of the sources of the Alexander legend within the Syriac tradition. All right? The most famous is Nishana de l-Iskandros, the Romance of Alexander, and then the Memra, which is attributed to Jacob of Sarag, all right, also known as the Song of Alexander, most likely composed in 628. These indeed have things that are in the Quran, and so some people have claimed that these two are the source for the Quranic account. Now, as good scholars, what would be one of the first things that we would want to ask? When did the manuscripts originate? All right, so you attribute this to Jacob of Sarag, all right? You say that it was composed 628, obviously, after him, but our first manuscripts are from the 9th century. Then when it comes to the Nishana de l-Iskandros, our first manuscripts come even later than that. Now, I haven't looked at the manuscripts myself, so I'm taking this all from secondary accounts. But when it comes to it, so, this is interesting that people will look at the Quran and say, oh, when did your manuscripts come from? How do you do this? And they've kind of given up on that line now because the material evidence has shown that even the manuscript account attests to the 7th century origins of the Quran. However, when it comes to these, we're told, oh no, that's not such an important question. Now, one of the reasons that we're told that is because we also have other accounts that connect Alexander to Gog and Magog, all right? These are some of these accounts. All of this doesn't actually tell us that much about what might have been known within Mecca and Medina, within Arabia at the time. It does, however, tell us something very important. It tells us that these stories of Alexander are in the air. So this is a very interesting account. This is by, I can't believe I've forgotten his name. Oh, Brandon Wheeler. All right. This is in his work on Surah Al-Kahf. He says, okay, when it comes to these particular accounts, we basically have some oral traditions that are running around. Jacob of Sarag's sermon, all right. Then you've got the Quran. Then you've got Sahabi traditions that come through Ibn Hisham, and that these come into the Quranic commentaries. But that then those, and there's a whole Ethiopic tradition, and some people have given up on trying to say that the Quran got it from the Ethiopic tradition, because we now can't say that it seems to have originated at a later time. What's happening here is that the Quranic account is actually being incorporated into other accounts and influencing. It was already circulating. There's this whole oral milieu of the Near East in which it's spreading. And then other people are taking aspects from the Quran and incorporating that. Now, when people first started looking into this story, they were saying within the Western Academy, they were saying, oh, well, this all has to have influenced the Quranic account. Well, that doesn't actually seem to be the case when we look at it. Or let's just at least say this. There is no way to materially substantiate that. Now, here's another way of looking at it, and this is by a colleague of mine, Farid Abdullah. He let me use this. He's done a lot of research, and his research helped me a lot in terms of trying to make some sense of this story. All right, so we have these oral Syriac legends that are going around. And you've got the Nishana legend, the Memra, attributed to Jacob of Sarag. All right, and then all of these lines, the reason that they are all written like this is that for each opinion of which one of these influenced something else, there's a counter opinion. So we really don't actually fully know. This becomes particularly important when we look at the fact that there are recent efforts to say that this is definitely a story that was taken and fully appropriated from other accounts. I would say that this is more what you have, and in fact what the Quran seems to be alluding to when it says سَأَتْلُ عَلَيْكُم مِّنْهُ ذِكْرًا, is, okay, this story is floating around, here's a little something about this story. Now, l-Qarnayn is known by many titles, all right? Among them you have, and these are all from tafsīr, all right? And this is Zamakhshari, Khazin, I think these are both from Tha'labi, and Muhammad Asad. All right, so Lord of the East and the West, Rabbul Mashriq wal Maghrib, all right? The ruler of Persia and Byzantium. It says that he reached the two horns of the sun, whence it rises and whither it sets. Some say that it has a physical connotation, that he had two flowing locks of hair, or that he actually had two horns of flesh. Some say that it means he had two lines of noble lineage. Some say that it means he had knowledge of the seen and the unseen. And some say that he ruled over two epochs or generations, l-Qarnayn. This is what Muhammad Asad has recently proposed. All right, so what's happening here? You put all of this together, and it means we don't know. It means that we are, in many ways, rajman bil ghayb. When somebody's telling you, oh, l-Qarnayn is this, l-Qarnayn is that. It is rajman bil ghayb. It is speculating at the unseen. So as we've seen, it becomes mixed with these legends. Now, Tommaso Tassé and Kevin van Bladel observe that these stories had been in circulation in multiple different ways. Now, van Bladel contends that the Syriac Nashana is the source for the Quranic account. And there have been others who have contested this as of late. But this is part of an overall trend of casting Alexander the Great as a pious servant of God. And it follows upon these trends that are in Jewish and Christian literature that portrayed him as a monotheist and sometimes as a saint. So in the Near Eastern Syriac literature, Alexander the Great is at times linked to the prophecy in the book of Daniel, from which derived the epithet, the two-horned. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with two horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. This again, okay, well, even if it does refer to this, this doesn't really tell us anything. This is an elusive kind of allusion to some event that's going to happen or some individual. Now, more recently, we've had Muslims who have argued that l-Qarnayn refers to Cyrus the Great, who united two large kingdoms, to which two horns, Qarnayn, would then refer. And this view could in some ways be said to be supported by the fact that the Jews of Medina most likely would have had a very high opinion of Cyrus the Great, since he's credited with bringing about the downfall of the kingdom of Babylon and the liberation of the Israelites. But there really isn't any literature to support this particular position. These efforts, again, to trace l-Qarnayn, is it Cyrus the Great, is it Alexander the Great, they do get into rajman bil ghayb. Now, as with the stories of the companions of the cave, the discussion of l-Qarnayn is here clearly intervening in legends that had become mixed up with debates, transmissions, and multiple sectarian appropriations. As Tommaso Tassé observes, the account on l-Qarnayn is highly elusive and implies these references to previous traditions. In response to the question regarding l-Qarnayn, again, see the Prophet says, سَأَتْلُ عَلَيْكُم مِّنْهُ ذِكْرًا, alluding to the fact that only a part of his story will be recounted. And this indicates that the Quran is consciously entering into a more extensive ongoing discussion or even debate regarding the whole of which it will not address. As in the previous narratives of the surah, the lessons the story provides. And this is why I think it's very important what's happening here, is that this is redirecting us towards the actual lessons that we can derive from the story. So, nonetheless, what ends up happening is that much like Western scholars, oftentimes when you get into the exegetical tradition, the Mufassirun are, as Rabia Bajwa observes in dissertation that she wrote on narratives in Surah Al-Kahf, so they are constrained by their commitment to historicity, or we could say by their attempt to discover the historicity of the account. Whatever the case may be, like the stories of the companions of the cave, the story of Moses and Khidr, excessive punctiliousness regarding details not found in the Quranic account may in fact distract us from understanding the lessons that are conveyed by the story itself. As several commentators write, God is saying that he will provide a report about his hal, his state. Now, that God established him in the land, وَمَكَّنَّا لَهُ فِي الْأَرْضِ, indicates, and here we have, I'm going to just put up, I'll refer to some of the Arabic as I'm going through this, but since I know some in the audience aren't fully familiar with the Arabic, I have the translation up. But I think many people here have also memorized Surah Al-Kahf, since we're supposed to recite it every Friday. So I'll be referring to it, but I won't have the Quran up, the actual Arabic up on the board. So, that he followed a means, فَأَتْبَعَ سَبَبًا, indicates that he employed means provided by God effectively. You have here where it says, I shall say, truly we established in مَكَّنَّا لَهُ فِي الْأَرْضِ, which, by the way, مَكَّنَّاهُم فِي الْأَرْضِ occurs, but مَكَّنَّا لَهُ فِي الْأَرْضِ only occurs in relation to to Yusuf, when it uses the preposition la, which is one of the indications that you could say that he is a prophet. Though I still think it's wallahu a'lam when it comes to that. So we established him in the land and gave him the means to all things. وَآتَيْنَاهُ لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ سَبَبًا فَأَتْبَعَ سَبَبًا. So he followed a means. What does this mean? Well, there are many ways to understand it, but it seems to indicate that he had knowledge of all things, that he understood the, might we say, the hukuk of all things, that is, their rights and their relations to one another, and how to employ them. So, what the implication is overall is that Dhul-Qarnayn's success came by following what God had provided for him. Just like the story of the companions of the cave, the Quran is here intervening in legends that were widespread within the Near Eastern milieu of late antiquity and directing the listener or reader back to God, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the source of the wonders and the power of this individual. When we come to the discussion of the three groups that Dhul-Qarnayn came about, there are occasionally efforts to identify some of the communities, but such efforts seem to often confuse the story rather than to illuminate it. As such, the three communities, I contend, are best understood as typologies, and that their specific identities do not matter for understanding the story itself. Nor are we given details regarding their actual state. These often come through tafsīr, and then we read the tafsīr back into the Quranic account. With the first group, we can surmise that they were committed to unspeakable atrocities, to which Dhul-Qarnayn was then instructed to rectify. All right, but the Quran is very elusive in this. So he followed the means. حتى إذا بلغ مغرب الشمس وجدها تغرب في عين حمئة ووجد عندها قوما. ووجد عندها قوما. That's all we get. Nothing. We have no details. He said, Ya Dhul-Qarnayn, O Dhul-Qarnayn, you may punish إما أن تؤدب وإما أن تتخذ فيهم حسنا. All right? So, you have these two approaches, but we don't know what they're doing. All right? So, Dhul-Qarnayn is allowed to take one of these two ways. Now, according to some commentators, Dhul-Qarnayn was instructed to call the people to Islam and belief in the one God. from this perspective, those who had done wrong are those who rejected the invitation, and those who believe and work righteous deeds refers to those who accepted his call and acted in accord with it. There is, however, nothing in the account itself to directly support this claim. Dhul-Qarnayn is given a chance to punish them or treat them well, and he chooses to establish justice in the land by punishing the zalimin, those who have done wrong. This implies that while corruption had become rampant, he nonetheless preferred to spare those whom he could. So Dhul-Qarnayn's reference to one who believes and works righteous deeds indicates, as we know throughout the Quran, of course, that both are required for entry into paradise. That he then says that he shall sanaqulu lahum, what is it here? Then he shall be brought back to his Lord. But as for the one who believes, or those who believe and work righteousness, فَلَهُ جَزَاؤُهُ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِ فَلَهُ جَزَاؤُهُ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِ الْحُسْنَى وَسَنَقُولُ لَهُ مِنْ أَمْرِنَا يُسْرًا. And we shall say to him that which is easy from our command, or min amrina could also be from our affair overall, indicating that he will be gentle to them and not overburden them with obligations that they would find difficult to fulfill. So having established justice in the far western lands, Dhul-Qarnayn then travels to the east, where he came upon a people for whom God had not made any shelter. And this is the most ambiguous that we have. ثُمَّ أَتْبَعَ سَبَبًا. And he reached the place of the rising sun. He found it rising over a people. لَمْ نَجْعَلْ لَهُم مِّن دُونِهَا سِتَرًا. We made no shelter for them or no cover for them from it. Now, exactly what that means. Some say that it means that they had no permanent structures, they had no buildings of any kind. Some say that it means that they had no clothing. But we don't really know. Some say that it actually, there's one interpretation that's very minority, but it says that actually they had a direct connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is completely outside of the standard interpretations that you see. So what exactly Dhul-Qarnayn did with these people or for these people is not clear. Many commentators suggest that he followed the same course as he had with the people of the far west, but there is nothing to substantiate this interpretation. Now, كذلك, here we are, كذلك, وقد وأحطنا بما لديه خبرا. So thus it was, and we encompassed that which lay before him in awareness. So what exactly does that mean? This is a very interesting use of this within this particular context, because it seems to allude to what we had in the previous account. Anybody know what I'm talking about here? وَكَيْفَ تَصْبِرُ عَلَى مَا لَمْ تُحِطْ بِهِ خُبَرًا. How can you be patient with that with which you have no awareness, which is the words of Khidr to Musa alayhi salam. And of course, all of us know that we could all recall that this seems to refer back to for all of us, this would bring up Ayat al-Kursi. وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنْ إِلْمِهِ إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ. All right, and they encompass nothing of his knowledge save that which he wills. Now, in fact, of the 27 instances when ahata, yuhitu, or muhit is used within the Quran, there are 7 instances that refer to instances of knowledge. In each and every one of them, it is talking about the limitations of human knowledge. Within that broader context, part of what seems to be being said here is, well, we know what happened to them, but you don't. So just leave it at that, in a sense. Now, the first community upon which Dhul-Qarnayn came was working corruption in the land and thus committing oppression. The second is neither oppressing nor oppressed. The third community upon which Dhul-Qarnayn comes is oppressed. Through the story of these travels, the Quran is thus providing a lesson for how those with power, for ruling powers, should handle themselves when they are in positions of power. there is much speculation regarding the location of the place between the two barriers, Bayna Saddain. Where do we have that? Yes, we had that in the back one here. Yeah. Then he followed a means, ثُمَّ أَتْبَعَ سَبَبًا حَتَّى بَلَغَ بَيْنَ سَدَّيْنِ, until he reached the place between the two barriers. He found beyond them a people لَا يَكَادُونَ يَفْقَهُونَ قَوْلًا, who could scarcely comprehend speech. All right. Now, exactly where that is, many of you know that people say that this is in Azerbaijan and refers to the Huns. But there's really nothing. I mean, that comes in Tabari, but that doesn't mean it's accurate, especially if we think back. Would the community of Arabia have had knowledge of that? Most likely not. So does this refer to that? And if you go through, some people say, oh, it refers to something that happened before. But that particular interpretation is what has predominated. But again, there's really nothing to confirm that particular interpretation. So such a reference could most likely be unknown to the Quranic audience. And efforts to identify the exact location are, especially when you look through all of the different tafsīr on it, again, rajman bil ghayb. The important aspect of the story is not where it is located, who exactly these people were, but what l-Qarnayn did when he came upon oppressed people in need of aid. These people could scarcely comprehend speech. So again, we don't know exactly what that means. Does it mean that they could not actually speak his language? Does it mean that they were in such a state from the oppression that they were suffering that they could hardly communicate? There are multiple ways that this could be understood. Now, there are many references in the Bible that could go back to this, and I'm not going to go into all of that right now. But, and of course, we have the issue of Gog and Magog, who exactly they are. Again, this gets into we don't exactly know. But what I would contend is very important here is that they are, first of all, they are mufsiduna fil ard. All right, so they are workers of corruption who are oppressing the people. And the people ask l-Qarnayn for assistance, and they offer him a tribute. هل نجعل لك خرجا. But l-Qarnayn refuses payment, saying, ما مكنني فيه ربي خير. That with which my Lord has established me or provided me is better. On the one hand, this indicates that he has no need of what they offer because the means which God has provided suffice and are more suitable. There's also a little thing here that when he uses, that they say, make a barrier between us, then, so they say sadda. And then when you come down here, he says he'll make a rampart. That in Arabic, the sadda is not as strong, or at least according to some commentators, is not as strong as a rampart. So in other words, they could do this, but with the means they provide, he can't actually build something that is as strong as what he can build with the means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided him. But more importantly than this, while l-Qarnayn may have been able to have defeat Gog and Magog himself, so according to accounts, he had the largest army in the world at the time, he told them to help him with strength. This indicates that the defense of the people for the defense against corruption and dhulm to endure, the people must take part in their own defense and be empowered to defend themselves. It is said that with his army, l-Qarnayn leveled the cliffs, then the people brought him ingots of iron, and rather than blowing upon them himself to create the fire necessary to mold the iron, he tells the people, anfukhu, blow, indicating that he is not only working to defend them, but more importantly, empowering them to develop the means of defending themselves. He then poured molten copper over it to fill the gaps and create a solid structure which Gog and Magog could neither scale nor pierce. Upon completing the rampart, l-Qarnayn declares, هَذَا رَحْمَةٌ مِّن رَبِّي. All right, this is a mercy from my Lord, acknowledging that great human accomplishments can only be achieved through God's mercy, since God is the one who has provided the means. Nevertheless, the l-Qarnayn knows that the wall will eventually be destroyed and thus tells the people, when the promise of my Lord comes, إِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ رَبِّي, he will make it into crumbled dust. جَعَلَهُ دَكَّاءَ. And this is likely the time when Gog and Magog are unleashed and will rush down from every hill, as is referred to elsewhere in the Quran. And they surge against one another like waves. At this time, it said, the trumpet shall be blown by the archangel Israfil, heralding the day of resurrection. Then all human beings will be brought forward from their graves and gathered together in the day of judgment. Those who, like Gog and Magog, disbelieved and worked corruption will be shown how. They are the people who, later on in the surah it refers to, whose eyes were veiled from the remembrance of God and who could not hear. Now the message brought to them, they couldn't hear the messages that were brought to them by messengers or what was brought to them by the l-Qarnayn. But what we have overall here is that these passages are evoking a broader Quranic theme that on the day of judgment, the unjust shall be made to see the realities that they have denied. And then introducing into it another aspect, which is that how do we deal with those who are zalimun? How do we deal with those who are neither zalim or mazlum, oppressed or oppressing? And then how do we deal with those who are mazlum? In a sense, giving us an overall key as to how it is that we can use the powers that we have. In this situation, the actual time at which the surah could be seen as significant, or the time at which it was revealed could be seen as significant, because it is said to have been a late Meccan surah. Some say early Medinan, most say late Meccan. And in which case, you're talking about the time at which you have the Muslim community is completely changing in its political formation, such that it will become a community that actually has the power to do something about corruption when it encounters it, whether it comes upon those who are oppressed or those who are oppressing in some way. And so, أقول هذا وأستغفر الله, as the Mufassirun say, because this is just one opinion among others, رجما بالغيب, perhaps. But I think that this is an important way that we can conceptualize this by understanding how other stories were circulating in the area, and that could perhaps give us a whole nother vista to understanding what the Quran is doing in addressing this story, and then how it is using it typologically to give a greater lesson regarding how to conduct ourselves as Muslims.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lumbard, for a very insightful, revealing, provocative, thought-provoking, and a bunch of other adjectives. You kept us awake, and what I'd like to do now is invite the students who are here to ask a question. Every student must ask a question. Otherwise, you're not having any of the food that's outside. Let's have the question. I know that some of the faculty, but you all have access to Lumbard, so let's give priority to our, as I like to call them, junior colleagues. Students, I know who you are, so please. أنت من
كلنا طلاب العلم.
تفضل يا أستاذ.
دكتور لامبرت على المحاضرة القيمة. وبالنسبة لي أول محاضرة أحضرها في التفسير باللغة الإنجليزية. والقضية التي تكلمتم عنها قضية مهمة جدا ولها أبعاد كبيرة، لأنها هذا السد يعني انهيار هذا السد علامة من علامات الساعة الكبرى. والقرآن اهتم كما قلتم بأمور خاصة مهمة تهم الناس في المقام الأول، لكن مع ذلك الناس اختلفوا في المكان الموجود فيه السد، هل هو في أذربيجان، بعضهم قال في ناحية تركيا، بعضهم قال في ناحية إسبانيا. لكن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم جاء إلى السيدة زينب بنت جحش وكان يعني مغضبا جدا، وقال لها ويل للعرب من شر قد افترى، فتح اليوم من ردم بيأجوج ومأجوج، وحلق بين أصبعيه صلى الله عليه وسلم. المشكلة في هذا السد، المشكلة في السد ده أنه يخفي وراءه يأجوج ومأجوج، وهم قوم كل كثير من الناس قالوا يعيشون في مكان مظلم لا يرون الشمس. هل يعيشون في أسفل الأرض أو يعيشون في مكان مغلق في مغارة؟ هذا لا يعلمه إلا الله. هناك محاولات لا سيما في أذربيجان إن هم وصلوا إلى جبل ووجدوا فعلا مواصفات السد، لكن طبعا هناك كمية كبيرة جدا من الجلود موجودة هناك. فالقضية هل هناك المؤشرات التي قال بها النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ويل العرب، لماذا خص النبي العرب؟ وفي الآية حتى إذا بلغ مطلع الشمس، يعني إذا يأتي من ناحية المشرق، والنبي قال ويل العرب. هل الإشارات الأولى تفيد أن يأجوج ومأجوج ترجح الاتجاه هو مكان السد موجود في تلك الناحية؟ وماذا نستفيد فيما لو وجدنا حياة؟ يعني الآن الأرض بما فيها هناك تطورات كبيرة جدا في علم الجيولوجيا، وتطورات كبيرة جدا في النظر في الآن يستطيعون معرفة البترول ومعرفة كل هذه الأمور بصورة. هل يمكن معرفة هناك ناس هذه المخلوقات العجيبة التي خلقها الله تكون موجودة في الأرض؟ هل هناك فائدة للعلم بهذه الأمور؟
In the words of Ibn Adl, كل الأبعاد يحتمل. so these are all possibilities. ممكن باللغة الإنجليزية؟ طيب. So I would say that these are all possibilities. Now, as regards the particular hadith that you were referring to, again, that one, there is an argument as to whether or not it's valid. There are people who say that من وجهة نظر الإسناد ومن وجهة نظر المتن, that they don't consider it to be valid. I don't know. Because أنا لست متخصص في الحديث. But so there are different approaches, and I would just say that I think that overall, the fundamentally important thing is what is the lesson regarding akhlaq that we derive from it. And especially people talk about what they refer to these days as intercivilizational ethics. And that this in some way is a way of conceptualizing intercivilizational ethics. And, all of the questions about whether it came from here or whether it came from there, whether it refers to this or whether it refers to that. I've heard so many interpretations. There are people who say that it's the Bermuda Triangle. My daughters came to me and they asked me, they said, but some people say it's Azerbaijan and others say it's Bermuda Triangle. I said, oh yes, they're from Azerbaijan, but they summer in Bermuda. This is you get into all of these speculations, which is rajman bil ghayb. And the most important thing is to be able to try to take it down. And I think that even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us to try to take it down, to derive a lesson. And certainly when it comes to Ashab al-Kahf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us to derive the greater lesson from the Ashab al-Kahf. Whereas we have Mufassirun who are like, and these are the name of the Ashab al-Kahf. Oh, and their dog was named this. Oh, and here's how they came to have the dog. You don't know. Astaghfirullah. You don't know how they ended up having a dog with them. I don't know how they ended up having a dog with them. And does it really matter? And does it really matter what the name of the dog was? I don't think so, especially for my akhirah. So these are the types of things that I think in many ways, when it says وَلَقَدْ أَحَطْنَا بِمَا لَدَيْهِ خُبَرًا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that this is something that we know the specifics and you don't.
Jazakallah khair. Yes, student?
Thank you so much for this wonderful collaboration. My question is related to the Surah Al-Kahf in whole. So based on your understanding, what is the wisdom behind choosing this surah as recitation every Friday?
Oh, so that's a very good question, and I would say that I mean there are many ways. I mean this is there are fada'il that are for all of the Quran, and most of them are da'if. But this is one of the few surahs where we actually have that the fada'il are sahih, and many that are hasan as well, and the injunctions to recite it, like with Surah Al-Mulk. And Surah Al-Kahf, these are the two that the injunctions to recite it are the strongest. Now, as it comes with Surah Al-Kahf, I think, honestly, that when you come to the story of the astaghfirullah, now that my mind is tired, I'm trying to remember the specific ayah. But when it says that it says that you what's that? لا 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 ليس هذا يعني قبل ما ذلك so استغفر الله. I have to recite the whole thing to come up with the ayah, and I'm not going to sit here and recite Surah Al-Kahf for all of you. But it's when they say so withdraw from them. So the manner in which the Ashab al-Kahf withdraw from society itself to preserve their deen. I think that in many ways that's part of what it is, that this surah and reciting this surah, that this is a way of withdrawing from society to, and focusing upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Fridays to, in a sense, bring us back from the dross of the dunya and everything that the dunya drags us into, and in a sense, recharge. And so that recharge into, you might say, there is actually one mufassir who says that, fi kahf al-qalb, to withdraw into the cave of the heart and nourish the heart, so that he doesn't say that this is so that you spend the rest of the week and you're nourished, but in a sense it fortifies us in that way. And just as it's said in some of those transmissions, that it preserves us from the calamity of Gog and Magog, that it is that if we withdraw into the heart regularly, in order to preserve ourselves from a shahawat of the dunya, then that actually is of fundamental importance for our spiritual lives.
Excellent. Another student? Yes, please.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Before I ask my question, I'd like to say that the story actually points to the limited of knowledge that he said. This era of haughty scientism, everything. And before Hawking died, Stephen Hawking said that by the end of the century, science will become a kind of God, which I think we still don't have all the answers. Yes, even if we have been able to, through our chemical powers, reconstruct the dinosaurs, but then we still have gaps to fill, and that's quite interesting. And now questions. At first he said you used the word Abrahamic religions. I'd like to know what you meant by that. Abrahamic religion, that's the first question. The second thing is, you mentioned that a lot of the time scholars try to establish the authenticity of the Quran, scriptures, but now we have that answer that it's authentic. But then what justifies the recalcitrants to believe in its message and to consistently look for ways to denigrate the text and the traditions brought to us? The third question is, scholars who try to tell the history of Islam in a shady manner, do you think they are doing much honesty to scholarship?
So I'll just go backwards with that. So in terms of a shady manner, I mean, I don't know, but I mean, there's a particular historical positivism that has crept into a lot of scholarship regarding the Quran. And I would basically say that when you have scholars who are willing to engage the textual traditions of Islam on their own terms, and they are at times coming up with observations. This is not always, as you put it, shady. And there are many people who are coming up with some very interesting and very respectable ways of understanding certain aspects of the Sirah and things along these lines. Even when we get into, some scholars who have tried to go into, or who have gone into and very successfully into studies of the manuscripts, have ended up finding things that they didn't think they were going to find, and ended up saying, actually, the manuscript evidence, the material evidence, points to the origins of the Quran in the middle of the 7th century, and they don't have a bone to pick either way. So there are some scholars who have done good, solid, objective work, and many of them. But at the same time, you have many who do have, as a particular, I would say that there is an animus towards Islam that you find at times. And actually you find this with the accounts of the story of the ways in which people have tried to use Syriac literature as of late. And this is, where people try to say, oh, because the Syriac says this, the Quran means that. That's actually the weakest and worst type of etymology, you could possibly have. That's like saying that because people in Britain mean underpants by pants, when somebody said Dr. Lumbard had on pants, it meant he wasn't wearing trousers and they could see his underwear. Astaghfirullah, that's just like, that's not how language works. And this is interesting that even al-Tabari and al-Qurtubi mentioned this in the introductions to their tafsīr, that we have all of these foreign words, but they actually make observations that linguists in the Western tradition don't really make until the 19th, 20th century, which is that when a word is borrowed from another language, the meaning that it had in the language from which it was borrowed ends up not meaning anything to us, or almost nothing, when we're trying to interpret it in the particular context in which it is now used. And so so you have to understand it within, that particular context. And so there's, this issue of false friends and false cognates. And we only know false friends and false cognates within language, we're actually dealing with language as a lived reality at the time. Like you say in Spanish, anybody here know Spanish? Yeah. Yo soy embarazado. What does that mean? No, it means I'm pregnant. What's that? Oh, yeah, sorry, yes, thank you, yes. So, okay, you corrected me, yes, all right. So, but if you were to say that...
You're not pregnant.
Alhamdulillah. So that's one of the things. Now, when it comes to some of the other issues, what were the other questions that you raised?
Abrahamic religion.
Oh, Abrahamic religions, yeah. It just refers to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All of the particular religions that claim to have their origins from the line of prophecy beginning with Abraham. Yeah.
Can we
No, you already had a question. We have to go. Okay.
Yeah.
What? The word using today in this currently, like Ibrahim, I think it had a specific institution and a specific meaning and specific goal as well. So I think to be using it, you have to be careful about it.
Inshallah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Suzanne. So you're a student now, huh?
Alhamdulillah.
I have two questions. First one relates to the previous question when you were talking about why you decide that I sort of cafe every Friday. And there is an ayah in أول فتية إلى الكهف فقالوا ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة. So your answer kind of inspired me. Is it a way to understand that in أول فتية إلى الكهف means like in أول الناس والمؤمنين إلى تلاوة سورة الكهف طلبا للرحمة وهي والرشد والحكمة رب العالمين. Especially that it comes at the beginning of Surah Al-Kahf. And my second question is, well, why did you include Ashab al-Qarnayn among the stories?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I was saying that these are the three major narratives. First of all, now of course, Ashab al-Jannatayn, yes, that's a fourth narrative. Mm-hmm. Some would even argue that the story of Iblis in the middle is a small fifth narrative. So you could put it at 3, 3, 4, or 5. But yes, the Ashab al-Jannatain, yes, as well. The only reason that I didn't actually include that there is because it, to the best of my knowledge, and I might be proven wrong on this, it does not seem to be making a specific reference to another story that is in circulation at the time. Maybe there is an account and I'm just not fully aware of it. But so I was just dealing with those particular narratives that clearly have a link to other stories that were in circulation, and that it's clearly engaging those stories or correcting those stories in some way or another. And as regards your first point, yes, I would fully agree. I think that that's a beautiful way to understand. أول فتيت إلى الكهف فقال ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا. Yes, that it's like, that we're going into Surah Al-Kahf in the innocence for us, just like them retiring into the cave.
Any more? Bayan, you are not a...
I don't think the other hand up close.
Alhamdulillah.
Okay, so this actually has been a question that I've been wanting to ask for years. Not you specifically, but since you are talking about this. So you talked about all these thousands of different tafsīr in the beginning. And okay, to introduce the question, we know as Muslims that what differentiates us, or what makes us unique, or our holy book unique, is that we were promised from God that this book is never going to change. That the words of the book are never going to change, unlike the other Abrahamic religious books. So the thing is, maybe the words themselves verbatim will not change, and the harakat and all of that. But then when it comes on the different tafsīr and the interpretations, and in this day and age, I feel like you can bribe anyone to come up with a tafsīr to fit whatever that's what they want out of anything. So how can we trust, or how does this not contradict that promise?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and this is one of the reasons why you have to have ulama, and why you have to have credentials, in a sense, is to basically say, anybody could sit down and read it. Now, there are, when you get into, like, people will distinguish between different levels of tafsir, ta'wil, and some talk about, al-matla' after that, based upon hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And many, will recognize, many mufassirun will talk about this, that like al-Khazin that we were referring to before, he says that the matla' is that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has opened to an individual that he has not opened to anybody else. But that doesn't mean that it's a tafsir. That doesn't mean that it's something that you can then bring out and say to other people, this is how we should be acting in accord with this verse. And this is one of the things that I think that it's definitely true that people, take liberties that should not be taken with this. And one of the ways to avoid that is to be thoroughly grounded in the tafsir tradition, and to be reading all of these particular interpretations that are coming forth in order to know that what you are saying is in fact grounded within the tradition. And so it should be in dialogue to something. It doesn't mean you have to follow the tradition at all times, but in dialogue with the tradition. And by being in dialogue with the tradition, that does put limits on how far one might go with particular interpretations of the Quran, and one might have what you could call a fath of some kind, but it really pertains to your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to your relationship with the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but doesn't have a broad application. And unfortunately, this is one of the things that you have to really come down. I mean, in the internet age, and anybody can just start up a blog or start up a YouTube channel or start up, something on TikTok and come out and start telling you what they think about the Quran in one way or another. that's very, very detrimental. And that's one of the reasons why I discussed Quranic hermeneutics and discussed the fact that many of us actually have, I think, a very partial understanding of the tradition of tafsīr and a very limited understanding of it. And that's something that we need to kind of try to go beyond.
Very good.
Yeah.
So I'm just playing the devil's advocate here. From the perspective of someone who is not Muslim, for example, I might say that we always, as Muslims, have an answer for everything. So there would be one ayah that's not so clear in the Quran that we've interpreted a certain way, and then someone will come and be like, well, this is wrong, this is not right, and then they'll be like, no, you didn't understand, and then we'll give them another interpretation, like, no, like at the forefront, the ayah will say one thing, like if you translate it into English and then you read it, you might think that, okay, this is not a good thing, but then the interpretation behind it is something else completely, and then you're like, okay, that makes sense. So as someone who is not Muslim, they might look at that and think, okay, well, you're always gonna justify something that seems controversial or whatnot, with whatever interpretation that you can come up with. So, I guess the question is how can we, I don't know what the question is actually, but how do we know that this is for sure? But like, why isn't it clear? Why are so many ayat in the Quran vague? So as someone who is not Muslim, they might look at the Quran and think, well then, why isn't everything just clear? Why does God have to be vague about everything? And then when you ask a Muslim about this, or a scholar or whatnot, they'll give you all these different interpretations to try to make it make sense, So how can you explain that?
Why are they, some of them vague? لِيَبْلُوكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. I mean, it's life is not a code of conduct. It never has been in any civilization. And so, no, I mean, in many ways, the Quran is, it is, trying, giving us trials over and over again. I would even say that there are certain verses of the Quran that are there almost as a trial for how a particular individual might interpret it, and might want to use those particular ayat as an opening to take license for their shahawat. And that really is, in many ways a test. And that's one of the reasons why we are enjoined to, continually read the Quran and deepen our knowledge of the Quran, so that we're constantly understanding these things, in relation to one another. I've been studying Quran and I've been writing articles about the Quran for 20 years now. And I just realized this thing about hata yuhitu, and that it always, every single time that it refers to human knowledge, it's talking about the limitations of human knowledge. And I've actually never seen that written anywhere else within a tafsīr or within a linguistic analysis of the Quran. And that's an instance where I would say, like, that's an observation that is empirical. And you can then derive things from it. But this is the point. We're supposed to constantly keep doing that with the Quran in one way or another.
I think, Bayan, if I may add to that, if you are aware that the Quran itself says that there are ayat that are literal and those that are allegorical, mutashabbihat or mukammal. The Quran itself says that. I mean, if you read Surah An-Nur, right, the ayat An-Nur, and then you try to read Al-Ghazali's Mishkat al-Anwar, you would either become enlightened or become, it depends on what you want out of it. I mean, one's intentions are always going to influence how they understand things, I was exposed to a guy called Michael Cook. I don't know if you know him. Stay away from him. Don't read anything he's written. Michael Cook and Patricia Crone, they're the most devious authors, Cambridge educated, and, so you've got to protect your heart and be careful. You again?
Does anybody else have a question or a comment?
I mean, give some, the gentleman here with the
Yes.
Palestinian flag on his arm.
Yes.
What is your name, sir?
My name is Rafaqat
And where are you from?
from the UK.
Oh,
Yeah. I'm a student and I'm a teacher at the school.
oh, please ask your question.
Yeah. So I want to go back to where you started from, when you started talking about colonial history and understanding from art. How far has decolonization of the Quran actually come? Because we are trying to understand everything. You mentioned at the start when you were trying to publish papers and you send it to universities, and sometimes you get a pushback saying that, hold on, we don't accept this research or whatever it might be. How far has that come, like, for them to accept the Islamic scholarship from centuries back?
Yeah, so that's a very complicated question. So first of all, let me clarify there. I'm not saying that every time that I've gotten an article rejection, it's because it should have been accepted. I've gotten some article rejections. I read the article rejection and I'm like, yeah, they've got a good point there. I need to go back to the drawing board. But what I have seen, and this is not just me, but it's been other people that I've noted that say, okay, so what we cited here for, shall we say, this particular linguistic issue, cited Zamakhshari or Gharnati, two mufassirun who are deeply involved in linguistic analysis, and people are like, no, you shouldn't be citing that, you need to be citing this, referring to some Western source on the Quran, which I'm sorry, as regards linguistic analysis, often doesn't go as deep. And so, these are types of things. And so it's something that one finds in certain spheres, not every sphere. Now that's as regards Quranic studies, but one finds it in other fields as well. I think that, for example, you could find it in the study of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. There's been an effort to try to cast Abu Hamid al-Ghazali as if he was a Trojan horse through which falsafa entered into Islam, and that he actually intended that, and he was disguising his intentions. Or if you actually read al-Ghazali very carefully, he's saying that as regards the realm of al-ilm al-iqtibasi, acquired knowledge, that falsafa has the most refined methodology for al-ilm al-iqtibasi. But as regards true knowledge, that you actually have to have al-ilm al-laduni, knowledge from on high, or knowledge that comes through ilham, knowledge that is related to, the light that is within the heart. And then he says that there are other means by which that is attained. Mainly, he says, the purification of the heart. And so he's saying that is actually the higher form of knowledge. But there's this cadre of articles and even books which try to cast that aspect of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali aside. So it's something that reaches into many different realms within the academy. And Bahnam Sadiqi, I think, has addressed it very well when he says that within the realm of Quranic studies, there are people who sit contentedly ensconced next to mountains of information that has been written by classical Islamic scholars that they don't even investigate, they don't even open, they don't even know what is in these books, and yet they say we don't have to read these books in order to understand the history. A great example is if you look at the history of tafsir, you will look at some histories of tafsir, like Andrew Rippin's history of tafsir, basically skips from the 9th century to the modern period with Tafsir al-Manar. We're talking about not only 700 years of tafsir here, but we're talking about the most productive period of tafsir in Islamic history. The vast majority of the tafsir were written in the, what we call it, I guess the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries of the Common Era. And yet those are cast aside as if we don't even need to know what is in them. And some of those were even printed. You could have gone and picked up a printed edition. And yet people didn't even analyze that. So there are multiple things like this. For example, Asbab al-Nuzul. People they're content to say, Asbab al-Nuzul is just this, transmitting things. Well, what about actually the way that scholars have been working with Asbab al-Nuzul and refining the methodologies for working with Asbab al-Nuzul? You don't find anybody discussing that within the context of Western academia. So these are some of the examples, but I think that at the same time, sometimes Muslims push back a little bit too far, and they throw out everything that you can get from the Western Academy. And this example, I think, for example, Angelika Neuwirth, when she talks about understanding the context of the Near Eastern milieu, she's saying, okay, don't try to reduce the Quran to that historical context, which is what some people do, but use the literature that is about the Near Eastern milieu of late antiquity to understand the overall cultural and epistemological context that the Quran is addressing. And that can actually bring us to some deeper understandings of certain stories in the Quran, like I would say, l-Qarnayn, Ashab al-Kahf, among others. So it is a mix. One has to very carefully thread this particular needle, shall we say, but one has to be very cognizant of the fact that there are those within the academy who want to take the whole of what Muslims have written about their own traditions and say, oh, these are just literary traditions, meaning these are just a record of what Muslims have thought, and not actually objective analysis of text and history.
Excellent. I think we need to wrap it up unless Dr. Dean has a question. Basma?
Just a remark, Dr. Thank
Please.
you so much.
Please, thank you for being
Thank
here.
you.
We
Yeah.
miss you. We miss you.
Learned a lot, and as usual,
We're happy that you're here today.
it's about the hadith, القول, the saying that الحكايات جنود.
Yeah.
نعم هي يقال أنها للجنيد الإمام الجنيد.
Yeah.
توفي في القرن الثالث الهجري.
Yeah.
لأنه في كتابي المخطوطة التي حققتها اعتمد على هذا الحديث على هذا القول.
Inshallah.
Jazakallah khair.
Yes, that's probably the earliest attribution. So yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, students and guests, we are fortunate to have the benefit of having this really enlightening conversation with Dr. Lumbard. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. And we invite you to, yes. We've got some light refreshment here. Please join us, and thank you for coming. Assalamu alaikum.
Nice.
Does.